Hello. It's good to see you. Today I have some more stories of olden times to read to you. Now, I typically tend to do these videos in a soft-spoken manner because people say they like to be able to hear what I'm saying without having to strain. And if I whisper, it's harder for them to do that. So typically I do not whisper these types of videos. Most of these stories are shorter than the ones that we normally read. We're going to go ahead and read some stories of, these are people who were born back in the early 1900s typically. Actually, we have one here that was born in 1895. We'll start with this one. And the title of this story is, I've Had a Good Life. Mrs. Myrtle Boyd Parsons was born in Montgomery County in the Onville community in 1901 and is now 80 years old. This was from a publication in 1981. She has resided in this small Pekin community in the same house for the last 53 years. Coming from a family of 7 children, she reminisces, I had a good childhood. We lived on a farm and worked. We got along real well and lived in peace. It was a home instead of just a house. Mrs. Parsons walked about 1.5 miles to school every day. She graduated from the 8th grade. It was great going to school because in those times there wasn't any entertainment for people, and it was so nice to be with people. We really enjoyed going to school. We were happy. In 1925, Mrs. Parsons married the late Clifton Parsons, and they were married for 55 years until his death in 1980. Together, they reared 4 daughters and now have 7 grandchildren. The oldest, Maisel Parsons Andrews, now lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. Eleanor Parsons Panetti lives in Charlotte, and Myrtle Ray Parsons Blake lives in Asheville. The youngest, Arlene Parsons Whitley, resides in Midland. I didn't live too far from my husband. He kept coming over, and so finally at last I told him there was only one way to get rid of him, and that was to marry him. We didn't start out with much, I tell you. Of course, we were happy. That was the main thing. We started out farming that first year, and the next year he worked in the peach orchard. Any regrets? Well, we tried to laugh about our mistakes instead of going around mourning about them. I think I've had a successful life and a good life. We've got a lot to be thankful for. We kept our health until just before Cliff passed. We raised our children, and they did well. I don't think that our children could have done any better. Now that's not bragging, that's just being thankful. Work and never give up. Mrs. Parsons advises today's youth, try to work hard, go to school and get an education and never give up. Her hobby is just to do work like housekeeping and yard work. I really enjoy my flowers more than anything, I reckon. They take my mind off of the bad things. Passers-by greatly enjoy her flowers when they are in full bloom. Must go on. When I lost Cliff, my husband, that was the most unusual thing, the worst thing that has ever happened to me, I reckon, but I had to take it like everybody else. Miss Parsons' one wish is to go to heaven when I die. And that is Mrs. Parsons. That's her story. And then right next to that, this book has suffered some water damage, so the pages are all ripply. I'm having to hold it like this for the glare, and it's a little difficult to see. The title of this story is My Christmas is Coming. Born in 1895 into a household of 11 children, 7 girls and 4 boys, Thomas Bowden is the son of the great General Captain Bowden and Tabitha Haywood Bowden. He married Kathleen Little in January 1915. Together, they reared 6 children: Bella Bowden Little of McGeehan, Seba Bowden of Baltimore, Maryland, Charlie Bowden of New Haven, Connecticut, Thomas Bowden Jr. of New Haven, Connecticut, Jesse Bowden, deceased, and Lonnie Bowden, deceased. Childhood memories. As a boy, I went rabbit and squirrel hunting with Pa. We lived on a farm, and my daddy taught us the trade of a farmer. We had cows, chickens, pigs, and mules. We planted corn, beans, and lots of other stuff. Back then, I plowed the fields with the mules we had. Along with helping my daddy on the farm, I had to sweep the yards. School. I went to school in Montgomery County. It had one room, so everybody went to school together. I did not go to school a long time because I had to help out on the farm. Hardships in life. In 1923, I lost my leg. I bruised my leg while working with a wood saw. I stayed in the hospital for a long time. After I was released, I traveled back and forth to the doctor. Finally, the doctors told me that the bruise was too bad and my leg had to be taken off. Old jobs. I cut wood for people. I had a wood saw of my own. I charged them $5 for one load. In 1950, I made cornmeal. I sowed the whole field in corn each year, then harvested it and stacked it up in the barn. I had my own mill, and I grinded the corn into meal. I took a little meal for myself if they could not pay me. I still grind corn today, but not as much as I used to. I repaired watches also. I cleaned them and replaced the parts which were broken or damaged. Family name. My daddy's last name was Hines. Some people took him from his natural parents for some reason. I don't know the reason. Their last name was Bowden. They raised him and gave him their last name. And that is Mr. Bowden's story, and I don't think we have a picture of him here. Not every story has a picture with it. And here we have Miss Annie Mae Smith McRae. Grandma McRae. Mrs. Annie Smith McRae was born in Montgomery County, May 28, 1914. She grew up on a farm with her parents, John Smith and Sarah Struther Smith, and is the youngest of 10 brothers and sisters. In 1931, Annie Mae married Joe McRae, and together they reared 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. One daughter, Joan McRae Tedder, now resides in Mount Gilead. Her other daughter, Margaret McRae Epps, lives in San Antonio, Texas. Her son, Murphy McRae, lives in Albemarle. Mrs. McRae lives in the Wadeville community and has lived there most of her life. One chore was to carry water. Mrs. McRae grew up on a farm near Stony Fork Church, and being the youngest, she was expected to cater to her older brothers and sisters. One chore she did was to carry water from the creek to their house. I don't know why people always built their houses on top of the hill and the water was at the bottom of the hill. I think that's one reason my legs are so long, getting so much exercise. 10 hours for $1.25. When the Depression came along, I didn't really know it was a depression because we had plenty of food to eat at home. We raised it. My daddy had bought another farm and mortgaged our home we lived in, and we were about to lose it, so all of us children at home went to work in a hosiery mill. I was 15 years old. We worked 10 hours a day for $1.25. I guess I thought I was rich when I got my first paycheck, which was for $7 or $8. We paid off the farm debt. My daddy sold 2 cows and bought a brand new 1929 Ford, which we used to go back and forth to work in. Something store-bought at Christmas. Christmases today don't mean much to me like they did when I was little. We looked forward to that with great anticipation. That was the one time of the year we got something store-bought. I learned pretty early that there was some connection between trips my daddy made to town just before Christmas and the gifts from Santa Claus. We knew that if Daddy didn't get to town, we might not get that surprise. So one year there come a big snow, and Daddy hadn't gone to town. Me and my sister were secretly worried whether or not we were going to get our surprise. But lo and behold, we got up and our usual treats were there. Unknowing to us then, we later found out a neighbor had gone to town on horseback and got our stuff. That's sweet. And then we have a story from Miss Catherine Priest. Don't know if we have a picture of Miss McRae. No, but this is Miss Priest. We do have a picture of Miss Priest. That's this story. Mrs. Catherine P. Priest was born in Portland, Maine, November 23rd, 1904, and is now 77 years old. She was born of William A. Parker and Lillian Sancre and had one brother, Clifford Parker. At age 26, she married George Yarborough Bonus and had one daughter, Dr. Georgia B. Adams. After her husband's death, she remarried to Henry C. Priest, who is now also deceased. Mrs. Priest has lived alone in Troy for the past 6 years. Her daughter and 3 grandchildren live in Montgomery County. Chicago in the 20s. Mrs. Priest lived in Chicago from 1917 through the early 30s. Chicago wasn't as wild and woolly as people think. Sometimes I felt much safer than I do now. As far as gangsters are concerned, you might live next door to one, you might know one, but they would be perfectly nice to you. If you were tending to your affairs and they were attending to theirs, there was no reason to be afraid. Although she had never been in a speakeasy, she knows what bathtub gin was. If someone had a drink, it was bootleg liquor. Everybody had liquor tested to see if it was pure, which was probably better than bootleg liquor you'd get today. Although she says Chicago wasn't that wild, Mrs. Priest did experience 2 strange incidents. Her husband was once, quote-unquote, taken for a ride by some local hoods, but he came back unharmed. She also found herself standing next to Al Capone and his brother in a meat market. He was buying steaks for his mother. She said, but he didn't bother me, and I didn't bother him. Husband's inventions. Mrs. Priest's first husband, George Bonus, made several contributions to the vegetable packing industry. He developed a system of direct labeling for the Libby, McNeil, and Libby Company. This enabled cans to be labeled by machines. He also developed the gentle press system of juicing tomatoes. Although it wasn't truly gentle, it really pressed down hard. During the first World's Fair in Chicago, Libby's had many booths that demonstrated the press and sold the juice it squeezed. Loves of her life. Mrs. Priest has twice visited the islands of Hawaii. I've always wanted to live on the island of Maui. The natives are so charming. I've always loved to play golf and drive a car. I always loved to get up and go places, but I'm not able to do that now. But what I've most enjoyed in life has been my child and grandchildren, whom I think are simply splendid. But then I'm a little prejudiced. And that is Miss McRae. And the title of this one is 9 Years Across the River. This is William Rankin Haywood. William Rankin Haywood, born on March 3rd, 1912, and Lanny Zelma Haywood, born April 1st, 1917, were married November 8th, 1941. Each grew up on farms on opposite banks of the Little River in Montgomery County. Rankin was the oldest of 7 children. Lanny was the 3rd child of eight children. They have resided in Onville community, 8 miles south of Troy, most of their married lives. Rankin and Lanny have 3 children, Truett Haywood of Onville Community, Wyman Haywood Sr. of Onville Community, and Vivian Haywood Perry of Candor. They have 9 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. Dating across the river. Rankin and Lanny Haywood dated for almost 9 years before their marriage. They lived about 12 miles apart. He would walk across the top of the Erie Dam on his journey to see her. Many times he would stop at a friend's house on the way home and spend the night. Wartime. Rankin Haywood entered World War II November 2nd, 1943, at 32 years of age. Mrs. Haywood was expecting their first child, Wyman Rankin Haywood. It wasn't until Mr. Haywood returned home from the war, December 15, 1945, that he saw his son, who was almost 2 years old. Grandfather's withered hand. This is from Mr. Haywood. My grandfather had a withered hand. He fell off of a horse when he was a boy, and his left hand never did develop like the other hand. He lived back in a time when most everybody took a drink of liquor now and then. He was caught at a still where there was 2 stills running at full capacity. The man that was helping him had gone to lunch. The revenue officers came in while he was operating 2 stills with a withered hand. The other man's dog came trotting up about the time the revenue officers came. The man had come up in sight of the stills and saw that something was wrong. He wouldn't come on up. So they took my grandfather and carried him to Greensboro. They tried him in federal court. His lawyer had him get up and show the jury his withered hand. His lawyers asked the judge if it was possible for a man with a hand like that to operate 2 stills at full blast. The judge said, no way. They turned him loose. Hunting possum. Mr. Haywood, this is his story here. I went possum hunting with 2 other boys. We went quite a distance from home and found the dogs barking at a hole in the ground. The dogs started digging in the hole that was in the ground. We went up above it and dug us another hole. We thought it was a possum. Come to find out it was a polecat. One of the boys said to me, "If you will hold the sack, I'll grab him." When the dogs barked, the skunk backed up to the new hole. The boy jerked him up right quick and threw him down in that sack, and we tied the sack. We had an odor worth talking about. We put him in a cage and kept him a while, but he finally got out. The hidden shoe, and this is from Mrs. Haywood. I liked to cut kindling when I was a little girl. Every time I would find a lighter stump, I would take an axe and cut splinters off. I had a new shoe. I got out one Sunday trying to cut splinters, and I cut my shoe with the axe. I would keep those shoes way up under the bed so Mama wouldn't find out. I had cut my Sunday shoes. She didn't find out about it until the shoes got old. She didn't really care then. Oh, if you've never gotten to smell a splinter from a lightered stump, it smells so good. It's wonderful for starting fires too. Milk house. Mrs. Haywood states, back then, when we were small, we didn't have refrigerators. My mother had a milk house, she called it. She dug a hole down in the ground pretty deep, and she had steps going down into the bottom. When she milked, she put her milk down in the milk house to keep it cool so it wouldn't spoil. Enjoyment. When asked what they enjoyed doing most in their life, Mr. Haywood responded, hunting and teaching Sunday school. Mrs. Haywood said, cooking, sewing, gardening, and just being with my family. And that is the story of Mr. and Mrs. Haywood. And I checked and we don't have a picture of them. And here we have a story, and the title of this one is Home Before 9. 8 miles north of Troy, in the small scenic community of Uwharrie, lived Mr. and Mrs. Emsley C. Hall. Mr. Emsley, also known as GIP, Christian Berry Hall, was born the third child of 6 children to John and Nancy Hall, July 11th, 1893, in Troy. He is now a healthy 89. Mrs. Ila May, known as Miss Ila Hall, was born the 5th child of 7 children to Raymond and Floral Clodfelter, May 8th, 1899, in Troy. She is now a hearty 83. Mr. and Mrs. Hall were married in the home of Jonah Hamilton in the Uwharrie Township near Troy 65 years ago on December 16, 1917. They have reared 4 children: Mrs. Nola Moselle Saunders, a resident of Troy; Mrs. Virginia Maxine Morris, also a resident of Troy; Mrs. Nancy Victoria Davis, a resident of Star; and a son, Mr. Lowell Clodfelter Hall, a resident of Biscoe. Mr. and Mrs. Hall have 6 grandchildren. Large families. Miss Ila says, "It was fun growing up in a big family back then. Families were close. They worked hard together farming and shared most of the work that had to be done." Junk food. Gibbs says, "Never heard of cola when we were little, not until we got older, and then it was the best drink we had tasted." Courtin'. Gibbs says, "I worked over there for her daddy, and I was going with her all the time. He didn't know it, but I was dodging him for 5 years." Miss Ila says, "I was 17 when I dated. Then when a boy come to your house or you two went to friends' homes, you had to be back home before 9 o'clock because that was curfew. We never went to movies because there weren't none around, so we visited friends." Chores. Miss Ila says, "Girls cooked and sewed, done housework. Girls also had to milk and gather eggs." 40 cents an hour. Gibbs says, "I remember working at the cotton mill down there in Troy for 40 cents an hour, and Ila made 35 cents. Good old days. Miss Ila says, the thing I miss most is visiting your neighbors and sitting around talking at night." $5 wedding. Gibbs says, "We had a small wedding. I rented some horses for $5 to carry us to the ceremony. As we were riding down the road in front of the 2 people that was going to be our witnesses, they turned down the wrong way on the road, and we got married before they ever showed up." Oh no. Discipline. Miss Ila says, "I never remember getting a spanking when I was young, or ever remember giving my children any." And Gibbs says, "My daddy only had to give me a hard look, and I knew exactly what he meant." Depression. Gibbs says, "During the Depression, I remember my sister having to wear the same dress for a whole week, then having to wash it on Saturday and wear it to preaching on Sunday." Miss Ila says, "People got sugar stamps, coffee stamps, and other things. There just wasn't any jobs then for people to get." Old-time doctoring. Gibbs says, "They used to use black draught, salts, and sometimes different roots and berries to cure things." Miss Ila says, "There wasn't no big hospitals or many doctors around, so you had to do the curing of the sick yourself." 2 best books. Miss Ila says, "The 2 books I remember most that was in the house, except our school books, was the Bible and the Almanac." Mud holes. Gibbs says, "When we were little, Troy was just mud holes here and there. There wasn't any paved roads, but we drove cars over them. You never knew if you was going to make it both ways you were going without getting stuck in the mud." Hobbies. Miss Ila says, all that I do now is work crossword puzzles in the newspapers, watch TV game shows, and read. I love to read." And Gibbs says, "I don't have a particular hobby. I just like to watch wrestling." Oh my gosh. That's cute. Oh, here they are. We have a picture of them right here. And next story is titled, I've Enjoyed My Life. Jewel Mae Warner was born in Montgomery County April 8, 1899, and is now 83 years old. She grew up on a farm with her parents, William and Frances Warner, and 8 brothers and sisters. Miss Warner is not married and has lived in McGead for the past 6 years in the house which was built for her and her mother. This is more or less the family home. Everybody has a door key, and they can come down here and make themselves at home and fix their own food if they want some. Before electricity. Miss Warner appreciates the advancements and inventions of the 20th century. Remembering her early years, she does not take for granted the improvements which make her everyday life easier. We didn't have electricity when I was young. We used a fireplace to heat the house and a wood stove to cook with. We had one little old kerosene lamp to study and eat by. We had a big old wash pot out in the yard where we'd fix a fire and heat the water to wash clothes with. We had these old irons that we had to heat by the fire to iron. Seems like when I moved to Charlotte, everything was different. They had electricity and hot and cold water. School days. We went to bed early and got up early. We got breakfast and helped wash the dishes and made up our beds and went on to school. We walked over there to Pinoka School and took our own lunch. We crossed a little old creek on a slab, no handrails or nothing, but we didn't fall in. Mother turned sick and had a little baby. I had to stop school to be with her. As far as I remember, I was in the 9th grade then. Despite Miss Warner's education being cut short, she managed a successful career with no regrets about the past. 40-odd years. Miss Warner has been a dedicated worker during her life. She gave Southern Bell Telephone Company in Charlotte over 40 years of devotion toward her job. I worked with Southern Bell for 40-odd years. I made bills to send out. I enjoyed every minute of it. I get my telephone free after working for them. They've been good to me and all their workers. Marriage. I never did get married. Whenever I was living in Charlotte, I was going with a nice young man. But when I worked with Southern Bell, if you got married, you just automatically fired yourself. They didn't want no married people there. I didn't marry because I was one of the older ones in my family and I had to work. Well, that's sad. That is the end of Miss Warner's story. I checked, we don't have a picture of Miss Warner. Okay. We weren't allowed to pout. That's the name of this little bit. Mrs. Lillian Deaton Bruton, the 6th of 14 children, was born in Montgomery County April 6, 1911, and is now 71 years old. Her parents were Jessie and Willa Deaton, who reared her and her 13 brothers and sisters. She married Alvis Byrne Bruton December 26, 1931. They were the parents of one son, Bobby, who was born May 17, 1933. Bobby and his wife Brenda reside in Lexington with their 3 children, Scott, Crystal, and Tracy. Mrs. Bruton lives on Highway 731 in Mount Gilead. Family. As a child, Mrs. Bruton lived on a farm in a small country community called Shannon in Robeson County. Farming, raising cotton, tobacco, and corn, and going to school were among the many activities that occupied her time. Having 13 brothers and sisters helped Mrs. Bruton to realize the importance of family closeness and sharing. We enjoyed each other. I helped gather eggs, and my older sister did the cooking. We all played hopscotch, read, and of course played ball, but we weren't allowed to pout or fight. If we did, it would get broke up. Mrs. Bruton moved to McGead with her husband and son May 17, 1938. She feels her greatest accomplishment was raising her son Bobby. He's smart and works hard. I'm proud of him. Dating. Mrs. Bruton recalls her first date. She was 17. Oh, they let us go to square dances, movies, and picnics, but we dated mostly in our home. We could go out once a week. When asked if the morals her parents stressed to her were similar to the morals believed in today, she replied, "Well, my parents stressed to always live a clean life and to take care of ourselves. They did not believe in drinking or in any of those things. My father never even smoked a cigar or took a drink in his life. Our parents weren't strict, they just wanted to bring us up right." A great influence. Mrs. Bruton feels the greatest influence in her life was her father. She, like all other girls, felt that she was her daddy's little girl. He never wanted us to do wrong, but he wanted us to be happy. He wanted us to have things that other children had. He taught me to work hard and to be happy. Advice to the young. Mrs. Bruton enjoys the youth of the community and tries to keep in touch with her accomplishments. When asked to give her advice to the youth, she replied, "Whatever you do, always do your best. Failure is not failure until you quit. Set all your goals high. Remember, what you are is God's gift to you. What you make of yourself is your gift to God." And that is Miss Bruton's story. And unfortunately, we don't have a picture of her. Now, this is the last one we're going to read for today. And the title of this one is Everybody Gets Together. Mr. Elo Hoffpower was born in El Campo, Texas, February 1st, 1913, to Joseph and Ellen Hoffpower. El Campo was the county seat of Worden County, located approximately 75 miles southwest of Houston and approximately 75 miles southeast of San Antonio. He grew up with 4 brothers and 4 sisters. Mrs. Zeddy Hoffpower was born in Montgomery County, November 10, 1914, to Walter and Maud Thompson. She lived out in the country with her twin brother and a half-brother and sister. She is called Zeddy by young and old. They have 2 children, Ruth Burroughs Townsend, who lives in Spring Lake, and Donnie Hoffpower, who lives in Greensboro. Nicknamed Hoppy. Elo entered the armed services in 1940. While he was stationed overseas, a commander began calling him Hoppy. The nickname spread, and he is known by friends and family as Hoppy. He does not recall any special event which prompted the name. Twins run in the family. Zeddy's mother had twins, Zeddy and her brother Zell. Her mother's sister also gave birth to 1 set of twins. Zeddy's first husband was a twin also. Her first husband's uncle and aunt had twins. Coincidentally, Zeddy was a twin and married a twin. Just get together. Their family celebrates holidays the way they feel is ordinary. We just have plenty to eat, that's all, Hoppy stated. Of course, they exchange Christmas gifts and watch their 4 great-grandchildren open their gifts. Sowing seeds. Zeddy and her brother and sister-in-law plant a garden every year. Hoppy suffered from a stroke several years ago and can no longer take as active a part as before. They plant when they're ready and don't go by the almanac. Zeddy says, "We've been told we'll have nothing but vines and blooms because we don't go by the moon or almanac, but we always have a good garden." Recipes. Hoppy remembers many dishes his mother made, such as blood pudding, crawfish pie, gumbo with eggs, and jambalaya. Blood pudding uses blood from a hog. He learned several recipes from his mother, but never took the time to write them down. Old hobby. Zeddy used to shellac abalone shells. She collected many in California in 1954 while Hoppy was stationed there. They smelled so bad we had to air them out for a long time. The meat was good, like white chicken meat. Depressing trick. During the Depression, Hoppy's father had several thousands of dollars. A man at the bank cheated him out of his savings. It's a good thing now that we have a Federal Reserve Board. Family reunions. The family attends the annual Morris reunion. It is held in June and was previously on Father's Day. In the words of Zeddy, any and everybody is invited. We go because my mother was a Morris. Everybody gets together and has a big time. Didn't have time to get acquainted. Hoppy served in the armed services for several terms beginning in 1940. I went to the Philippines, Japan, and the South Pacific. He remembers the bombing of Pearl Harbor well. At the time, he was stationed in Florida. We were only there a few days, and we were packing to leave. I didn't have time to get acquainted with anybody. Hoppy had several close encounters with death. He was on an old crooked road when Japanese bombers flew over. We started running toward ditches. A man heading for the same ditch as Hoppy was killed. Hoppy escaped by falling and stumping his toe. Also, on a moonlit night, air raids had gone on throughout the night. Shortly after the men had left their tents, the tents were bombed. He feels he was very lucky. And we do not have any pictures for Mr. Hoffpower or for Mrs. Hoffpower. And that is going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed getting to hear these stories of olden times. I have more in this book, and I have another couple of books that have some stories in them as well, and we will read those at a later date. Thank you so much for being here. I really hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again really soon.